In his new book, The Desecration of Man, Carl Trueman writes, quote, "After Nietzsche's madman rushed into the town square, he wistfully concluded that he had arrived too soon, that his hour had not yet come, and that the implications of what he was saying, that God was dead, had not yet become clear to those who had killed him. As the madman so clearly saw, this is a theological issue with profound practical consequences. If we have killed God, must we ourselves not become gods in order to appear worthy of the deed?" Close quote. Carl Trueman, on his new book, The Desecration of Man, How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity Now. My name is Tod Worner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Carl Trueman is a professor of biblical and theological studies at Grove City College, a visiting fellow at the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government at the University of Notre Dame, and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. An esteemed church historian, he is the author of more than a dozen books, including The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World. Carl Trueman, welcome.
It's great to be here, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
Segment 1, The Man and the Madman. In the opening pages of The Desecration of Man, Carl Trueman declares, quote, "There are only two ways to address the question, what is man? We can embrace Nietzsche's challenge and continue the project of self-creation, thereby becoming gods ourselves, or we can embrace the Christian faith with its dogmas, cultic practices, and its ethics. There is no stable third option. We must choose today whom we will follow, Christianity's Messiah or Nietzsche's madman. All else is nihilism," close quote. So, Carl, it's good to have you back on again. And I want to begin with a pivotal point you make early in your book. Today, we do not suffer from disenchantment or disillusionment with religion, which is like a sense of malaise or a sourness that results in us falling away from the faith. But rather, you insist we are involved in the process of desecration, as you describe the denial of sacred boundaries, the profanation of all that is holy, and an exhilaration in this process of desecration. In other words, we move from a passive death of religious sensibility to an active murder. So this is going to inform, obviously, the rest of our conversation. But let me ask you the stark and frank question by asking, has it gotten really that bad?
I think so. One of the examples I use in the book is the shift in the language on abortion. In the 1990s, the Democratic platform was very much that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare.
Yeah.
I personally disagree with that, but it seems to me that that's a position which involves acknowledging that the world is, hey, it's not what it should be, and sometimes we have to do bad stuff. We regret it, but we just have to do it. If you move to 2024 and the election then, abortion was being trumpeted as a basic human right. There were people shouting their abortions. There were abortion clinics being advertised, I believe, at the Democratic National Convention. It's interesting that shift from a sort of reluctant acceptance to, as the language you've used, a sort of exhilarated exultancy in what's going on. And that raises the question of why. And I think the answer is we get a buzz out of smashing through sacred boundaries. We get a thrill from destroying God's image. What is it that makes us feel most godlike? It's the creation of our own values. Well, how do we create our own values? By breaking through the values that we've inherited, by breaking through the sacred boundaries that we've inherited from previous generations.
You know, it's amazing because when you talk about the way that transition from the safe, legal, rare wording to the celebratory nature of abortion, I think many of us remember when we first saw Gloria Steinem wearing a T-shirt that says something to the effect of, I'm proud of my abortion, or I love my abortion. And it was such a moment, it was a macabre, shocking moment to think, I don't think we've ever thought that would ever happen. And yet here it was, this defiant and celebratory nature of something that most people across all borders or all boundaries at one point or the other, except for these really, really weird, edgy, almost contrarian people, would say this is a tragedy Some people are going to argue this tragedy has to happen, has to be a right, blah blah blah. Others are going to say there's no room for this, and so on. And the Catholic faith says there's no room for this. But it was a shock to see that. So that sea change was to me, it was jarring, just as you've said. Carl, this desecration has led to what you call anthropological confusion. As Chesterton once lamented, quote, "We are under the same mental calamity. We have all forgotten our names. We've all forgotten what we really are," close quote. What's your sense about how has it become so easy to forget?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with in some ways, the material conditions of the world in which we find ourselves. If we were to go back 800 years to medieval Europe, uh, everything about us would be given. Everything about us would be, in some sense, beyond our individual control. We'd be born in a certain place, and we'd be pretty much stuck there. We'd be born to a certain family, and that would bring with it certain obligations that we had no choice but to sort of step up to. Our career paths. We wouldn't really have had career paths because, your dad's a blacksmith. I'm going to put money on the fact that you're going to be a blacksmith in 20, 25 years' time. We live now in a world where none of those things apply to most of us anymore. We move very freely. We choose our careers. We choose our circles of friends. We don't feel obligations towards family members as we used to. Everything has become very fluid. And in that context, forgetting that we have a solid given identity becomes very plausible and very easy. And one could extend that into the realm of morality, for example. Why have we forgotten traditional sexual morality? I would say because we can. It's not that human beings' sexual desires are any more or any less holy and godly than they were. We're all sinful human beings. But in the 19th century, you had to behave yourself or face very serious consequences. Today we have technologies, antibiotics, abortion, things like that allow us to forget the values of our parents and our grandparents and to do so with impunity.
It's interesting because when you're saying what you're saying, it makes me think of the notion of rootedness, there is, as you've kind of described, this kind of sense of, kind of this dark delight that comes with, sticking it to the man, which contravening the traditions, with going our own way, finding ourselves, this kind of liberating notion. And yet at the end of the day, you can find yourself liberated from those very things that provided you solace, that provided you a sense of person and place, a sense of identity, a sense of meaning and purpose altogether. And I think oftentimes in the wild rage to tear ourselves free, we forget the incredibly rooting and grounding aspects that make us who we are to begin with. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, I think so. There's a price to pay for our liberation. And in some ways, Nietzsche's Madman puts his finger on this in The Gay Science. He doesn't just present the death of God as an unmitigated delight. He presents it as, a scary challenge. What did we do when we unhitched the earth from the sun? He says, when we set ourselves off on a path of drifting aimlessly. And you see that in society today. Again, think about the sexual revolution. It's always fascinated me that the New York Times never profiles 80-year-old swingers. Why not? Well, 80-year-old swingers, they're kind of pathetic, dirty old people, and they tend to be broken and alone.
Yeah.
If Hugh Hefner couldn't get away with it, nobody can. And nobody. By the time Hugh Hefner died, I didn't see anybody looking at Hugh Hefner and saying, that's what I want to be when I'm 80 years old. It was a rather pathetic scene. So I think there's a price to be paid for this freedom, and that tying ourselves down, accepting our natural obligations, our natural limits, may not sound liberating, but is oddly liberating in many ways.
Carl, anthropology, you assert, is inseparable from theology. When you ask the question, what is man, a wonderful opening chapter to your book, The Desecration of Man, you tell us that Christianity tells us that A, we are exceptional, B, we are persons and not objects, C, we have freedom wedded with responsibility, and D, we are embodied. How does modern Nietzschean nihilism desecrate? And I know that's the premise of the book,
Yeah.
so we're going to keep unfolding this, but some opening words. How does modern Nietzschean nihilism desecrate this Christian anthropology?
Well, the basic point, of course, and again, I think this is where Nietzsche is much more insightful in a strange way than many other philosophers of his day and indeed of days since. Nietzsche understands that if you get rid of God, you have to redefine man.
Mm.
If man is made in the image of God, then that's who he is. But you cannot continue to enjoy the benefits or the capital that was built upon the idea of man made in the image of God if God is dead.
Mm.
This is his big objection, say, to a figure like Immanuel Kant. He thinks Kant does a great job of dealing with God and getting rid of God, but then smuggles him back in this notion of moral human nature. And Nietzsche's madman is really saying, no, I'm not going to let you get away with that.
Yeah.
You get rid of God, you got to go all the way. You have to become the one who creates your own meaning and your own values at this point. So I think that's a big part of it. What I do in the book, of course, is I take those themes, for example, personhood, and ask the question, so what has the modern revolution done to that? Well, the modern revolution promises that human beings will be free, freer than ever before, free of God. What it delivers, of course, is a sub-personal understanding of what it means to be human beings. Human beings become objects. The sexual revolution, the promise was it will liberate women. It's made women more into sexual objects than they ever have been in history, I would say.
Yeah.
The reproductive revolution, IVF, for example, on the one hand, it promises that it can deliver children to childless couples, and so it does. But in the long term, it's turned children into commodities, into objects. It's been a way of smuggling eugenics back into the way we think about what it means to be a human being. So the lack of grounding, I think, in the image of God, it sounds liberating. You get rid of God, we get rid of ourselves made in his image. We're now free to create ourselves. Well, what have we done? We've degraded ourselves. And to go to the exceptionalism argument, I make the point in the book that human beings, yes, we're exceptional. And what have we used our exceptionalism for? We've used our exceptionalism to convince ourselves there's nothing special about us in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, right.
When Peter Thiel was asked by Ross Douthat at something to the effect of, should humanity continue? And he hesitates for a disturbingly long time before he answers the question. That brings it right to the fore. Artificial intelligence, transhumanism has not exalted us. It's brought us to the point where we actually think we're not that great and perhaps not necessary to the future at all.
So much of a thread through so many of your works implore, without being a Cassandra, if you will, but you implore us to follow these things to their natural ends. This is the Dostoevsky kind of adage, if there is no God, everything is permitted. Well, what does that look like? If we look at all the various things that are being championed in the modern culture that provide us, quote unquote, liberation, but especially put the finger into the eye of tradition and the eye of faith and the eye of things that are strictures. On the front end, it looks like it's all gain and no loss. And yet, followed to its natural end, it's sort of like, well, how does this book end? What's the epilogue? Invariably, it's dark. Invariably, it's dark and it's unconsidered. And so the darkness basically consumes kind of the unwitting person walking and whistling their liberated tune and so on. Is it? And again, this sounds like a wrap-up question, but it isn't quite. Is it surprising that we just don't learn? I mean, do you feel like there's an incuriosity, or does our culture basically sweep this stuff so well under the rug that the concluding narrative of these stories of liberation, the concluding narrative that oftentimes ends badly, it just so beautifully kind of eclipsed that that people just are unfamiliar and they move along their merry way, distracted and ready to walk off the cliff themselves?
I think it's sort of all of the above. if you like. I think there's certainly been a great tendency. It's hard to know exactly when it begins historically, but let's say from the 17th century onwards, there's been a tendency to think of limits more and more as problems that need to be overcome.
Yeah.
And it's a tendency to think of setbacks, again, as technical issues. And therefore, I think when we move down a path that brings us to the brink of destruction, our answer is not to pull back. Our answer is to come up with a technical solution that gets beyond this problem and takes us to the next stage. So I think there is that drive in being a fallen human being that refuses to learn that important lesson. Limits are. We live in a world where we just see limits as problematic inhibitions, preventing us being authentic, preventing us who we are destined to be.
Mm. Yeah, so good. I want to return to the word we used earlier, exhilaration. Carl, why is there a dark exhilaration, the act of desecration?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and again, I there are a couple of passages in literature that I think of when you ask that question. One of them is in Augustine's Confessions, Book 2, when he has that famous incident where he steals some pears with a group of friends from a neighbor's garden, and he goes out of his way to tell the reader that these pears, he'd got better pears at home. The pears were pretty foul. He thinks they fed them to the pigs. They didn't particularly enjoy the pears themselves, but they got tremendous exhilaration from doing it. He talks about how they ran off into the dark, killing themselves laughing. They just had such a blast. And he reflects on this. And the answer he comes up with is, why did I commit this pointless sin? Is, if you break the law, you set yourself above the law. And who is above the law? God is above the law. Breaking the law brings with it that buzz of feeling like God. And then there's a passage in one of Dostoevsky's, not one of his sort of major famous novels, but his book, Notes from a Dead House, which is a semi-fictionalized memoir of his time in prison in Siberia. And he engages in various pen portraits of fellow prisoners. And reflects upon what made them go down the path they chose. And one of these prisoners is a very urbane, cultivated, pleasant fellow. And Dostoevsky discovers that he's what we would now call a serial killer. And he sort of, this blows his mind. It's kind of, wow, this guy probably kept his lawn, nice. He was a good neighbor. He's killed all these people. And he says, it's as if, the first man he killed, he probably did it for a reason. He doesn't state the reason, but you can imagine, let's say the guy finds out that his best friend's run off with his girlfriend and he stabs his best friend. We don't agree, don't want to encourage our listeners to stab best friends in those situations. We really don't want to go there. But we could certainly say you could see the reason for it. It's not a random killing. There is a rationale behind it. But Dostoevsky says, but having done that, it was as if he'd crossed a line that was sacred.
Yeah.
And having crossed that sacred line, it was as if nothing was sacred to him anymore. And Dostoevsky's conclusion is that the power rush that this man got from taking the life of another human being made him feel godlike. It was a Promethean moment. Now, I want to say, in generally speaking, we're not, your average man is not a serial killer. We don't do that kind of thing. But we do get a buzz out of breaking the rules.
Yeah.
Why? Because when we break the rules, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Augustine would all agree that we effectively make ourselves God. And, and what greater rush can there be than making yourself God, than killing the God, having the blood of the God on your hands? That's a buzz. That's a rush.
It is funny because it does return us back to saying, why do we consider pride to be the deadliest of the seven deadly sins? Why do we hearken back to the first of all sins, which was the father of all sins, Satan in the garden saying to Eve and Adam, you shall be like gods. Like you said, there is that that absolute buzz in pursuing something that enlarges us in this fashion. And as you've just described, at some point, and it's at some point was probably in the garden, we decided we want to contravene the rules, or we're tempted to contravene the rules, and that's our battle until the end of time. And in our modern culture, as you describe in this book, it's one thing after another. Only it's empowered with a philosophy that's been bled white of God and a technology that is unsurpassed, and we're racing headlong into sort of the abyss in the process. Obviously, it leads to what you describe as the desecration of man. So it's a fascinating, and a scary story to tell. Carl, in the Desecration of Man, you write, quote, "The theoretical repudiation of Christian orthodoxy by the intellectual elites takes time to work its way into the broader dynamics of the culture. In other words, there will be a time lag between the desecration of God and the desecration of man," close quote. Now, when I read this, it made me think of the notion that politics is downstream from culture, culture is downstream from religion. If the wellspring of religion dries up, culture becomes debased, politics becomes decadent. Would you say that the residual fumes of Christianity are finally getting dissipated, and are we arriving at a full and dark reckoning?
I think so. I mean, I don't want to sound hopeless at this point, because I think there are signs that some people are waking up to the seriousness of the situation. And I don't want to imply that I'm a kind of cultural pessimist determinist. But, again, to think about the sexual revolution, what you have in the early 20th century in Britain, you have the Bloomsbury Group, Lytton Strachey, Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, E.M. Forster, Bertrand Russell. These are elite members of society who are able to sexually behave as they want. They have the money, we might say, and the status to get away with it. My grandparents, my great-grandparents, they were working class. They couldn't get away with that sort of behavior.
Yeah.
As we've moved through the last 100, 120 years, though, technology has become widely available. That means that the privilege, the sexual privilege that the Bloomsbury Group enjoyed has been democratized. That we can all behave as they did and get away with it now. So we are seeing, I think, this percolation of moral anarchy through society, most definitely. And that's pushing out the last, as you say, the last fumes of Christianity. Christian behavior still had a hold as long as, we might say, nature and the way we lived sort of reinforced it. Yes. That's no longer the case. Having said that, I don't want to sound hopeless, because what we're seeing at the moment, interestingly enough, once again, particularly among the intellectuals, is a realization that this can't go on.
Yeah.
This is disastrous. You have somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and her husband, Niall Ferguson, both of whom I think 10, 15, 20 years ago would have identified as atheists, now going to church, professing Christianity. Initially, or partly, I think, because they saw the cultural effects of the loss of a religious metaphysic within society. But having gone to church, realizing that actually there are some serious doctrinal claims there as well that they have to reckon with. We're seeing, I'm at Notre Dame this year. I believe at Notre Dame they're seeing more young people either returning to the Catholic Church or coming into the Catholic Church for the first time than certainly within recent memory. And from what I can make out reading the national press is Notre Dame is not unique in that. This is a phenomenon that's taking place at Catholic campuses across the country. Will that be a lasting phenomenon? How deep is it? Well, we don't know. We only time will tell. But what it does indicate is the thoughtful elite are beginning to realize, or many of them beginning to realize, we've got a problem in how we think about and frame reality. And we're looking for an answer by returning to traditional Christian approaches to things. So yes, I think that the last fumes of religion in wider society are vanishing. But that's creating some interesting opportunities that I think could be signs of hope. Who knows? I'm not going to say, yes, we're going to see a major religious revival in the next 20 years, but nor am I going to say this is superficial nonsense. I'm going to grab hold of every opportunity as it presents itself and trust that something will come of it.
And I want to reinforce, in reading your book, The Desecration of Man, it is not only diagnostic, but it also has those elements of hope and a process or a way forward without being programmatic, so to speak. So it's a very intelligent, but in the end, hopeful treatment of the issue. Carl, theory, the philosopher Charles Taylor writes, is often the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in the social imaginary is that it is shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society. The two words social imaginary populate your book. Just tell us, what is the social imaginary and why does it matter?
Yeah, what Taylor's getting at there is the fact that the way we think is, generally speaking, not grounded in reading a good argument and being persuaded by it. You might say, Trueman. I typically don't steal things. Why don't I steal things? Well, I don't steal things because I was brought up in a house where stealing things was frowned upon by my mum and dad. Now, since I've become an adult, I've read books of ethics, and I've come to understand there are some good arguments against stealing. But my intuition that stealing is a bad thing is not grounded on those arguments.
Yes.
It's grounded on, let's say, the atmosphere, the ethos, the rituals, the attitudes that I imbibe through growing up in the kind of home that I grew up in. And we can expand that to, in some ways, to the whole of life. The way we think about the world connects, really, it's the way we imagine the world to be. And that, I think, is, it both makes the situation more complicated, but also points us towards answers in our current situation. It makes the situation more complicated because you realize you can't win just by making an argument.
Yeah.
Anybody who's had a discussion with any Christian who's had a discussion with an atheist, or any pro-life person who's had a discussion with a pro-abortion person, will know, arguments can take place, but by and large, what's driving the differences is not an argument. It's something deeper. It's the way the world is imagined to be. So it makes the situation more complicated. It's not just a case. We can't solve the world's problems by finding that silver bullet argument that will just carry all before it. On the other hand, it points us towards a solution in that we realize that to win the battle, we have to win the battle for the imagination.
Yeah.
And that involves arguments, but it also involves rituals. It involves friendships. Paul says, bad company corrupts morals. What does he mean by it? We could translate that to Charles Taylor terms and say, bad company shapes the social imaginary in a bad way. Yeah. We can, not everybody can grab hold of the ontological argument for God's existence and use it as a compelling evangelistic tool with their neighbor. But every Christian can be kind to their neighbor and make their neighbor wonder, what is it that motivates or drives this person to treat me so kindly, to treat me with such respect?
Yes.
So part of what I want to do in the book is to make readers think about richer ways of addressing the current crisis. And, to go back to the abortion issue, I would hate people to think that I simply see the problem as existing on the left in our society. I think we see these dehumanizing patterns across the political spectrum at the moment. And I use the example in the book. I say, it's one thing to believe that there should be an intelligent debate about immigration. It's one thing to believe that illegal immigrants should be deported back to the country from where they've come. It's another thing to post pictures of the children involved, crying with fear, and taking pleasure in those pictures on your social media account. Those kind of things indicate to me what's going on in the social imaginary. And the way to combat that is to produce beautiful things that stand in opposition or contradict it.
What I love about this is I think about this in my career as a doc, practicing internal medicine, is that the totality of the person sits before you, not just their problem. The totality of the experience I have with a patient transcends just a prescription. It's a 25-year relationship. It's walking the walk with them, learning about their experience with their family, understanding some of their trials, maybe an addiction that's been battled, a cancer that's been overcome, a wedding that happened last summer with a daughter or what have you. Seeing them on their good days, seeing them on their bad days, whatever the case may be. And to some extent, I love that notion that this kind of smug notion that I can just put before you a calculated theoretical argument that will win the day in the Oxford debates or whatever it may be. No offense against Oxford, but it, as opposed to the experience a person has of seeing all facets of and living a life experiencing all facets surrounding this particular issue, or surrounding what does it mean when someone says they're Christian? What is my experience with Christians? What is my experience over years in friendships with a Christian, or a child of a Christian, or being antagonized by a Christian, or whatever it may be? It's the totality of experience that ultimately makes, I don't know who was it I don't know if it was Tertullian who said, look at these Christians, how they love seeing them and just being kind of almost taken aback that I can't deny that these people in this midst of this hardship will still love and give to those who are cast off and so on. So I really appreciate the notion of saying it is an enveloping experience that converts and that draws people over time, drop by drop, as opposed to a pat argument effected in a lecture hall or articulated in a well-placed essay. Is that a fair way of articulating this?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm a Cambridge man, so you can insult Oxford.
That
all
landed
you want.
just right then. That landed just right.
Terrible place. But I think you're correct. I mean, our Lord Himself says, by this shall all men know that you're my disciples, by the love you have for each other.
Yeah.
I think as a sort of Christians of an intellectual bent, we can tend to prioritize doctrine and ideas. And that's not to say that those things aren't very important.
Right,
they are. But we can sometimes then use that emphasis to excuse us from doing the other stuff, the practical love, the living as a community, that sort of thing. And I think you're absolutely right that it's that other stuff that is particularly powerful. Powerful inside the church, of course. I taught at seminary for many years, and students, I was also a pastor, and students would say to me, how would you respond to this situation or a person with this problem? And my answer was always, well, first of all, I have to qualify my answer because it's never an abstraction. When we talk about a situation, it's abstract, but the person, the agent involved in that situation always has their own personal history. And if I were to apply that to many who've lost their faith over the years, I don't think I've ever known a Christian who's then lost their faith, who lost their faith for purely intellectual reasons.
Yes.
Often the intellectual arguments come after the fact as a way of justifying a decision that's already been made. But the crisis has been perhaps a personal moral one, or has been something they've witnessed in the church that has just led them to walk away. So I think you're absolutely right, Todd, that sort of broader existential context is critical. And if that applies within the church, how much more does it apply outside the church? Where people who are not Christians, I would say, on one level, they're looking for an excuse not to be Christians. Let us not, as Christians, provide them with cogent and coherent excuses not to be Christians. And that comes down for most of us almost all of the time to how we live and behave and speak, not the arguments that we make. And it's one of the reasons why I fear the impact of social media on the church, because social media encourages us to think of that other person simply as the sum total of the ideas they express, to reduce them to that we don't get a chance to really see or think about human beings as whole beings existing in relationship and community with others.
Carl, what is expressive individualism, and how has that impacted the social imaginary? And before you answer that, when I'm reading this, it reminds me a little bit of the pre-modern notion of liberty, which is free to be virtuous, which involves an ethic of study, sacrifice, and generosity to arrive at virtue, versus the modern notion of liberty, which is license. If it feels good, do it. Describe a little bit about expressive individualism.
Yeah, it's a term I think coined by Robert Bellah in the 1980s, but picked up and developed perhaps in its most elaborate form by Charles Taylor in his work, The Sources of the Self and A Secular Age. And expressive individualism really attempts to capture that element of what it means to be a modern person, whereby one's inner feelings and desires become the center of one's identity, and therefore the ability to express those ideas outwardly and to be affirmed by society in one's expression of those desires and feelings becomes central to being authentic. We could see this, for example, think of how we think of the LGBTQ movement. When somebody says, "I am a woman trapped in a man's body," that's a quintessentially expressive individualist kind of statement, in that my feelings, my inner feelings, are the determinative feature of who I really am, even if they stand in contradiction to my body. That's an extreme example, but I think all of us understand that to some extent, that if I ask my students, who are you, they'll typically go to choices they've made. 13th century, you'd have said, well, I come from this village, I belong to that family, I'm going to be the blacksmith because dad's the blacksmith. If I ask a student today, who are you, they'll tell me about choices they've made, by and large, choices they made because of desires they've had or because of aspirations and feelings they've had. So we're all expressive individuals to some extent today. Now, one of the things that strikes me about that is it's inherently iconoclastic, if you like, in that for me to know that I'm truly me, I have to act on my own desires. And what is the best way to know that I'm doing that? Well, the thing that I most want to avoid is being part of the herd, going with the flow, doing things the way they've always been done. So it's very fertile soil for an approach to man that involves desecration. It doesn't necessarily involve it, but it, I would say, strongly points in that direction. It has a gravitational pull towards transgression and desecration.
It's interesting because, like you said, it's sort of being different for the sake of being different, and yet it's as akin to what Chesterton said about the notion of progress. Well, everybody associates progress with good. He says, but you can progress in the wrong direction. You can progress in a straight line to hell. That's progress, and the point is to change and progress in the opposite direction, in the other direction. You also made me think about when Antonin Scalia was giving one of his pithy quotes about the platitudes that are so awful in almost every graduation speech. And he said something to the effect of, you'll hear over and over again, follow your own star. And he says, well, maybe we should say, unless you're Hitler, and then you should follow anybody else's star, because Hitler's star is the wrong star to follow. So it makes me think about, Oscar Wilde. I think you quoted Oscar Wilde sniffing about the conformists. He says, most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions. Their lives are a mimicry. Their passions a quotation. To what you said, is that iconoclasm at the end of the day another sort of predictable form of conformity that the person professes that they are avoiding?
Yes, and we see this. I give a lecture at Grove each year, and as part of the Capstone Humanities course, when I'm teaching on expressive individualism, and I say, okay, today we're going to deal with one of the big philosophical questions of our era. That question is, why do all teenagers look the same? It's a facetious question, but it gets at there is a conformity to desecration at the end of the day. If you're going to be a rebel, then you're going to look like every other rebel out there. It's impossible to avoid that, and that's what makes desecration such a an insatiable and voracious thing,
Mm.
in that as soon as you've rebelled against something, you've established a fashion.
Yeah.
It stabilizes, and then you've got to rebel against that.
Yes.
So you end up with this continual transgression. It's not a push to find true human nature and then settle on that. Human nature becomes this aesthetic of rebellion, perpetual rebellion, continual revolution.
Segment 2, the permanent revolution. In The Desecration of Man, Carl Trueman writes, quote, "The revolution that modernity represents is a never-ending one. It is not that the old beliefs, values, and practices are overthrown and something new and stable is put in their place. It is that the practice of overthrowing what is, whatever it may be, is the project. When transgression and negation become the great values of a society, then permanent revolution becomes the default cultural setting. Or to use theological language, when desecration is a virtue, the profanation of all that is holy is not a moment or a phase, it is the ongoing norm." Close quote. Well, Carl, you teed me up for that segment. Isn't a revolution that never ends a contradiction in terms? Doesn't a revolution have to end somewhere?
Strictly speaking, I guess yes. It can end in the complete annihilation of what it means to be human. How long it will take to get there, who knows? But yes, I'm building at that point in the book actually on the Catholic philosopher Augusto del Noce, who points to the fact that there are different kinds of revolution. There are revolutions that attempt to take us back to something. And I think perhaps, we're in America's 250th anniversary this year. One might argue that the American Revolution was a revolution of that kind. When you think of the role that the Magna Carta played in the thinking of the early founders of the American Republic, it was an attempt to return to something. Then there's a revolution that attempts to carry us forward to a new thing. And we might say the French Revolution perhaps fitted into that. Certainly, Marxist revolution in Russia, Soviet Union fitted into that. The attempt to move into the future but establish the end of history, to establish something stable. But Del Noce says that there's this third kind of revolution, which is, we might say, revolution for the sake of revolution, when I would put it using the language that Goethe puts in the mouth of Mephistopheles in his great play, Dr. Faustus, the spirit of negation, when the game of revolution is simply the destruction of all that is. And, that helps explain, we see that playing out in society at the moment when you think of the rather strange political alliances that have emerged in the last few years. LGBTQ pride people protesting in favor of Hamas. Again, I'm not wanting at this point to take a particular stand on anything going on in the Middle East, but simply to point out the fact that it's very strange to have radical progressives feeling common cause with those who are really, reactionary religionists. What binds them together?
Yeah.
Well, what binds them together is a common hatred of traditional Western values. They want to tear those down. They share that spirit of negation. They have no positive vision that they share. They simply want to tear down America, we might say. So, permanent revolution becomes this, the transgression. When transgression is the virtue, then as soon as any category is stabilized, it's the new sacred, and it's ripe for desecration.
Carl, nothing you write in The Desecration of Man, nothing represents the dramatic triumph of modern expressive individualism more than the comprehensive overthrow of older patterns of sexual morality, patterns that were explicitly grounded in a religious understanding of nature and purpose of sexual behavior. And you say this, and it was a very stark thing to say, and I was fascinated. It is the sexual revolution more than any other single thing that has served to shatter traditional religion. Close quote. This may go without saying, but let's say it. Carl, why is sex so powerful with respect to the upending and uprooting of religion and the religious sensibility?
Yeah, very good question. A couple of comments as sort of prelim to my answer on that one. I would want to argue that, first of all, sexual desire is a fundamental component of what it means to be human,
Sure.
normative component. That's why, if you go back to the Iliad, we can't really find concepts of race in the Iliad, but we can understand the plot because it's about sexual desire. So sexual desire is one category that transcends cultures, transcends time. It's a very fundamental component of who we are. Secondly, when you look at the world's great religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and then you move into things like Hinduism, sex is typically given sacred significance. The sexual activity in I checked this with a Muslim friend. In Islam, sexual activity requires special washing afterwards. Normally when you go to pray as a Muslim, you wash from the elbows to the tips of the fingers, I believe. If you're going to prayer after sexual intercourse, there's a whole body wash that is to be engaged in because sex is seen as having sacred significance. We move into the Judeo-Christian tradition. Of course, the Old Testament is full of rituals surrounding the sexual organs and the sexual function of the body. And the language of cleanness and uncleanness is used there. Move into the New Testament. Paul makes the point that the man who has sex with a prostitute has committed a particularly heinous sin. It's, Paul says elsewhere, if you've broken the law in one place, you've broken it in all. There is a certain unity in sin for Paul. Every sin cuts you off from God. But the man who's joined his body to a prostitute has committed a particularly heinous sin because he has sexually united his body with somebody he's not married to and has therefore sinned against his own body. So sex carries this tremendous sacred significance, and the religions of the world reflect that. Why is that the case? Well, we can speculate, I suppose, but I would say, where are human beings most godlike? In the sexual act, because the sexual act leads to the creation, the mysterious creation of new life. That's a godlike act. I've mentioned this in numerous lectures, but I'm a grandfather now, and I remember the first time I held my granddaughter in my arms, and my mind went, I think it's to Psalm 100. I think it's Psalm 128, verse 6. May you live to see your children's children. And I remember before I became a grandfather, when I read that verse, I just thought that the psalmist is saying, may you live a long time. When I held my granddaughter, I realized, no, that verse is not about length of time. It's about the peculiar, miraculous blessing of seeing life created by life that you have created.
Wow.
That's incredible, quite incredible. And so that takes us to why is sex sacred? I say, well, one reason would be it's the point at which we are most mysteriously like God. Well, that then makes it an obvious target for desecration. If I want to be most godlike, what do I need to do? I need to evacuate sex of its sacred significance. I need to decide. I need to, as Nietzsche would say, create its own value. I need to turn it from sacred procreation into trivial recreation. And as I seize control of sex, I myself become as godlike as I will ever be.
Well, that's something. I mean, that's profound power, and obviously it's hubris that comes with that power. With that, Carl, there comes this this change in sex being something that we do to something that we are, and there's been this modern kind of alteration in the conception of what sex and sexual intercourse. How did that melding of sex with identity undermine faith and upend our culture?
Yeah, again, good question. I mean, historically, I think Sigmund Freud plays a key role in this. And Freud, to his credit, I think he grabs hold of the fact that he realizes, as I've said a few moments ago, sexual desire is a fundamental component part of what it means to be normatively human. It is something that really does define us in many ways. What Freud does in his taxonomy of growing up is he really identifies human beings from infancy to old age as defined by the nature and direction of their sexual desire. So he makes sexual desire absolutely foundational, the foundational point, not just a foundation, but the foundation of who we are. And that shifts attention away from sex as act to sex as desire and identity. And that's a highly plausible thing for him to do because, as I've said, sex is a powerful drive and a perennial drive within human beings. We're sort of ripe to find that idea plausible. To return to the social imaginary, it sort of correlates with how we imagine ourselves to be. It reinforces that in many ways. So there's that component. What was the part of the question, Todd?
It was how did the melding of sex with identity undermine faith and upend our culture?
Yeah. Well, it's a couple of things there. First of all, there's the obvious one that when you start to think of sex as recreation, or you start to think of it as self-expression, then it requires you to change your view of restrictions on sex. So, the laws in the Old Testament that forbid men from having sexual relations with other men, that were understood as prohibitions on behavior, actually become prohibitions on identity. So they become very, very vulnerable to that. They start to seem oppressive, not liberating in what they in that modern social imaginary. Second thing, and I think this is more subtle but important, it changes what I think is the God-given nature of sexual activity. Sexual activity really is about the giving of oneself to another. Once we shift into the idea that sex is my identity and it's the way of me expressing myself, it instrumentalizes my sexual partner. They become a thing. Yeah. They become a means of me realizing myself, not somebody to whom I give myself. Now, what's interesting here, of course, is that we have an intuitive understanding that the biblical position is correct. Where do we see that? We know that sexual assault is more serious than other forms of assault. We're not in the same room, but if we were and you leaned over now and punched me in the face, Todd, it would be distressing to me. But I bet 6 months from now, I'll be sitting at a dinner table somewhere, killing myself laughing, saying, remember when I was interviewed by that lunatic, Tod Worner, who punched me in the face out of the blue? It would become a matter of laughter.
Yeah.
But if I was in the presence of somebody who sexually assaulted me, I would never joke about that. It's qualitatively different. And the question is why? And here I would go to the work of people like Roger Scruton and Francis Beckwith, who in their different ways make the case that sexual assault is different, because what happens in sexual assault is that somebody takes from you that which can only be given by you. In other words, it's an act of theft. And what are they taking from you? Well, I would say, in agreement with those two guys, what's being taken from you is your very self. That the rape of a woman is the theft, the forcible, violent wrenching of that woman's own self from her. Something that she can only voluntarily give has been torn from her. And that thing is the thing that lies at the deepest core of her being, her very self. So the sexual revolution is really predicated on a lie that sex is recreation. And it tilts us towards treating other human beings as instrumental objects. And in the book, I make the case that, pornography is, it's on a logical continuum with the sexual revolution. It simply takes the logic of the sexual revolution to the nth degree. Sex becomes simply about the instrumentalization of other people for my pleasure. And I give nothing at all of myself to those other people in gaining that pleasure.
See, you do such a good job in this book, among many things, of talking about this cognitive dissonance that exists. The notion that sex is special, the anticipation of a wedding night, the horror of rape, and yet the culture wants to say that simultaneously sex is meaningless, hookup culture, prostitution, things of that nature. And again, it comes back to what we talked about at the very beginning here. In the name of the liberation, in the name of the revolution of all these values, in the name of the desecration of man and the disdain for God, we need to effectively say, we see what you're trying to sell us on the front end here, where it seems like it's all gain and liberation and pleasure, and kind of arriving at who you're describing yourself to be. And no one talks about the farther end of this, the other side of this. It is not even page 16 of the newspaper. It is not published. And as a result, I mean, and I see the wreckage of lives of people afflicted after hookup culture, and there's an incurable sexually transmitted infection, or there's a loss of the sense of pleasure, or the relationship troubles with somebody that they were with that kind of stepped away because of their more licentious background, or a person who survived abortion, or a person who has endured rape. As to your point, it is a qualitatively different violation or loss when this is trifled with. And sadly, the society says, here, try this. I think you'll like it, and is nowhere to be found when the reckoning comes. So anyway, thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to the fact that once you decide sex is recreation, you will tend towards thinking that any problems generated by that decision are technical problems to be overcome. You catch a disease, well, we just need to develop an antiviral or antibiotics that will deal with that. There is no corporate repentance for what we've done. The acknowledgement that, yes, actually there are limits. Those limits have moral significance and we need to respect them. A good, if somewhat odd example of this is the debate that goes on in the gay community in the 1980s when AIDS first becomes a really big issue. It's forgotten now, but the gay community was divided between those who felt, well, this is the moment when we need to start corralling our behavior. We need to close down the bathhouses. We need to stop being so promiscuous. And those who took the view that, no, we carry on regardless. We just need medicines that will get us out of this quandary. Well, it was the latter lobby that won. And I think that's emblematic. It's, again, an extreme example, but that's emblematic of the attitude of our age, that there are no moral problems in these. And there are no moral limits. There are only technical limits that we should use our brilliance to overcome in some way. We've invested in a lie, and we keep throwing good money after bad.
This next question speaks exactly to your point about technology in that respect. In The Desecration of Man, Carl, you write, quote, "We fool ourselves if we believe the death of God has indeed freed us from a sacred order. On the contrary, it has merely subjected us to a new one that is overseen by a different priesthood, the scientists who have mastery over reproductive technology," close quote. You go on to write, quote, "Human exceptionalism, that unique capability we have as a species of intentionally reshaping our world and ourselves by sheer brilliance and willpower, seems to have enabled us to do just that. Yet what is the end result? We've become gods, but at the paradoxical price of becoming nothing much at all. Just one more commodity that can be produced on demand. We have desecrated ourselves," close quote. So, Carl, again, maybe a few more words on this. How has technology desecrated us and made us objects instead of subjects?
Well, again, think of the example of children in this context. think of the way that, no-fault divorce, for example. It's not a technological thing, but it's certainly part of our modern expressivist culture where, hey, if my wife is no longer allowing me to be who I really feel I am, then I can get rid of her. But what has that done to children? It means that children are collateral damage of that relationship. They're to be treated like pieces of property in the division of property after the divorce has gone through. Think of in vitro fertilization. Now, I know this is a sensitive topic because the childless couple who are contemplating IVF to relieve themselves of their childless condition, their desire is a good one. It's not like desiring an abortion. The desire for a child is a good desire. But when we think about how the culture of IVF reshapes the social imaginary, what does it do? It makes society as a whole think that children are commodities to be made to order. I raised the question in the book of, what goes wrong? What happens when IVF or surrogacy go wrong? It's not like ordering a substandard product from Amazon that you can just return to Amazon. This is a human being that's the result. And the example I use in the book, I think, is that of baby Gammy, who was a child born to a surrogate for an Australian couple, born to a surrogate in the Philippines. Baby Gammy was born with Down syndrome. And the Australian couple did not want to adopt him or have him as their child. So there was a long and terrible legal battle that ultimately freed them of any parental obligations. Throughout the whole process, of course, baby Gammy was essentially treated like substandard goods. We've ordered this thing and it's not the thing that we ordered, and therefore we don't want it. Well, think about how that shapes how we think about humanity. Amazing technology that allows us to have surrogate children. But what has it done to our thinking about children? It's turned them into designer commodities. It's made them less than what they were.
Hi, I'm Tod Worner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. Reconsecration. In The Desecration of Man, Carl Trueman writes, quote, "The answer to desecration is consecration. And so the question now becomes, how do we reconsecrate our humanity?" Close quote. So, Carl, before we answer this, a question many may have is, just look at us. Again, maybe this is to conjure for a moment your cultural pessimism. Are we too far gone? How eager are we to give up being our own gods? And are we conscious enough of the destruction we have wrought? Or are we simply invincibly blind to it?
It's a good question. And I think we need to make a distinction between society as a whole and groups of people within that society. And I would say, in terms of society as a whole, we're not going to solve this problem by a week on Wednesday.
Yeah.
The problem is too deep-seated. The cultural intuitions, the social imaginary is so deeply ingrained in such a problematic way that you can't turn this thing around quickly. Now, that can precipitate despair. And I would say that that's a kind of modern problem. One of the things that is often not commented on in modernity, but I think which is part of modernity, is we tend to like things to happen quickly. We're not patient anymore. I've actually asked a Catholic friend this. I got the impression that people become saints quicker now than they used to. And I'm not sure what the statistics are, but my Catholic friend said, yeah, that was his impression too. And it's of course, because we want Pope John Paul II. We want to be there when he becomes a saint. We remember him. So the impatience of modernity works against us at this point. It can make us unhappy. It can lead us to despair. But I would say, set that aside. Let's think about the long game. Let's think about the early church, for example. In the early church, you start with 12 guys. They're not particularly sophisticated or well-trained. They're fishermen. They're artisans. There are only 12 of them. They're up against the most powerful and successful military empire the world has ever seen. Yeah. And yet, in the space of 300 years, these 12 guys trigger a movement that transforms the known world. I want to say today, we need to think in those terms. We need to realize that any transformation that's going to be worth achieving, it's going to take a long time. I'm doing things today not to see results necessarily in my lifetime, but maybe my granddaughter will see them in her lifetime. So first of all, we need to rethink our perspective on this. Secondly, I think as Christians, of course, we do know how the story ends. Jesus wins, to put it sort of very, very simply. Yeah. The church is the meaning of history. History does culminate in the marriage feast of Christ and his bride, the church. That's guaranteed. That we don't know when that will happen, but that is guaranteed. So as Christians, there's never any excuse for total despair. We can have a sober view of the prospects, but we should not despair because we know how the story ends. Thirdly, we need to ask ourselves, what difference can I make? And I think most of us, we're not going to turn Congress around next week. Where can I make most impact? Well, for me, it's in the classroom. It's in my local community. It's in my local church. I need to focus my attention and my efforts there. I need to be thinking about how can I transform the people that I actually have personal engagement with on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. And that in some ways makes things a lot more manageable.
Yeah.
If I'm not carrying the weight of the world on my shoulder, but merely the need to fulfill my Christian obligations to those who cross my path, that's much less of a burden than turning the culture around. Yes, I can lament the wider culture. I can pray for the wider culture. I can do things about my local culture. Yeah. And that's where I think it starts. That's where it started in the first century with the 12 fishermen that Jesus had called to be his apostles. And that's where I think it starts for us today. The culture has gone a long way. But we can turn things around in our locale, and who knows what foundation that will provide for the next generation. I love that line in Lord of the Rings. It's not in the book, actually. It's in the movies. It should be in the book because it's one of the great lines when Theoden is about to head out for the last battle and his retainers say to him, you're going to lose. This isn't going to go well. And he says, yes, but I will meet the enemy on the field of battle nonetheless. And everybody's going, yes, that should be our attitude today. Yeah, maybe I'll lose in my generation, but it won't be because I didn't meet the enemy on the field of battle as and when I could.
That's so good. I mean, I because I want to keep talking to you, I should end this podcast right there. But I'm not done yet. I'm not done with you yet. That is so good, and I think that the brilliance of the church and its championing of subsidiarity, bringing things to that local level, not because it makes sense only, but it is the place of our, as we talked about, the totality of experience. is our immersion with other people, people that we trust and people that we're working on trusting more or who are working on trusting us. It's the entirety of that fullness of experience beyond a far removed argument that's being made and so on. It makes me think of, and I think it's an apocryphal quote of Mother Teresa or Saint Teresa of Calcutta, the notion of if you want to bring about world peace, go home and love your family. The other thing I think about is, so you're at Notre Dame and I have a daughter at Notre Dame, and I wrote a piece in the wake of some of this stuff going on with various hiring kind of upsets and so on, and the piece is called, not to plug it, but was called What I Saw at Notre Dame, and being down there on the ground level, going to mass, rubbing elbows with other students, attending this, going to the art museum, and so on. It was a wash in Catholicism. My daughter had to arrive. She was coming from her dorms. Had to arrive 40 minutes early to get a seat in the cathedral or the basilica on Sunday morning, because it was standing room only, and also because the front 15 pews were filled with OCIA candidates. To your point, it's among the most robust season of Notre Dame Catholic converts in recent memory. And yet what one sees from the far away level and reading various essays, kind of the wheels are falling off and so on and so forth. And yet there it is, person to person, dorm to dorm, professor to student. And any place, in all places, well, we've got work to do and so on. But to your point, there is something exquisite. Again, another probably apocryphal quote of Aquinas, I think, is, if you want to converse with someone, take them by the hand and lead them. And I just think that profound notion of fundamentally being intentional, living in a Christ-like fashion, willing the good of the other, of the person that sits across from you, doing grand things across those internet and all that we write and publish and so on and so forth, but just being there and being engaged with someone else, that you change the world one person at a time. And I think that's a field of battle worth fighting on. So you said that very, very well.
Yeah. Well, in the book, my last chapter is that I say there are three things that we need to do. One is what I called, being a Protestant preacher, I like my alliteration, creed, cult, and code. Yes. And I say, the creed, we need to teach people well. We can't allow the culture to carry the Christian message anymore. It doesn't work. So we need to be very intentional in how we catechize our people in the basic truths of the faith. Secondly, we need a cult. And what I mean by that is a liturgical form of worship that reinforces, that dramatizes, that shapes the imagination relative to that creed. Catholicism, of course, has its formal liturgies. Many branches of Protestantism do as well. Every church, I would say, has it. Every church has its code. Mm-hmm. The only question is it a formally well thought out one or not? And we need to think about that. We need to make sure that our services carry what I call the rhythm of the gospel, reinforce the rhythm of the gospel. And then I end with code. And code, for a lot of Christians, it's the way we live, has often tended to focus on the stuff we don't do. We don't sleep around. We don't have abortions. We don't do this. We don't do that. What I zero in on there is hospitality. And so, one of the things that marked the early church was its hospitality. And hospitality is the place where you overcome that problem of treating other people as things. Mm. When you have people into your own home and you sit round a table and share a meal with them, it's humanizing in a deep and profound way. They cease to be the collection of the ideas they've expressed on the internet, and they become real, concrete individuals, unique in their own way, but also sharing a common humanity. It's interesting, I've just finished teaching a course at Notre Dame this semester on, I called it The Abolition of Man, which was a shameless way of trying to pull C.S. Lewis people into the class. We did look at Lewis, but we looked at a lot of other texts as well. And I had a little note from one of the students afterwards, thanking me for the class. And in it, she said, the high point really was when we gathered at somebody's home for the class, and it was a pizza evening. We just sat around the fireplace eating pizza and talking about the texts. And she made the comment to the effect of, that's when we didn't just, learn about what it means to be human. We sort of practically embodied what it means to be human. And so I think listeners might be thinking, wow, the intellectual problems of the contemporary culture, they're way beyond my ability to address them in terms of arguments. And I want to say to that person, that's okay. The church is a body. The different parts of the body have different functions, as Paul tells us. But maybe you can be hospitable. Maybe you can open your home to people after church on a Sunday and have them around for a meal and sit and talk to them. And that might be the most powerful argument for the humanizing nature of the gospel that there is.
Carl, I want to ask you, because I think it's so important. And again, this gets to, to my way of thinking, you notwithstanding the fact that you wrestle with, in your great books that you write, you wrestle with honestly and in the most articulate fashion some of those vexing challenges our culture has in this day and age. You don't just celebrate the problem, and you do move in every work you have towards the bright, sunny uplands of hope, if you will. So creed, cult, and code. One of the points you make when you're describing these three things, what we believe, how we worship, and how we practice this in the larger world, is that they are intertwined. You can't operate effectively one without the other. And I don't want to say operate, that sounds more like it's a program. But the bottom line is, the fullness of faith cannot be arrived at if one of those three components, creed, cult, and code, are missing. Can you say a word or two about that?
Yeah, I mean, some of that is driven by classroom discussions I've had at Grove City College when I've taught this sort of thing. And I think one of the things that seems to me is perhaps true of maybe all churches is that it doesn't matter what church you belong to, what congregation you belong to, you probably do one or maybe two of those things well. The third one gets neglected. So in my own tradition of sort of high Presbyterianism, I would say we do the creed really well. We're big on doctrine. The cult, yeah, we're okay on that, I guess. I wouldn't describe our worship as beautiful, but it sort of makes sense. The code, maybe we're not so good on that. Maybe we can be a little cold, a little isolationist, a little unfriendly to outsiders who don't look like us when they show up at our church. And the church might be different. It might be that their worship is very beautiful and they're really friendly, but they're lacking in the creedal aspect. They're perhaps not as keen on doctrine as they should be, according to the New Testament. And I think when you look at those two different churches, one can make a number of observations. One, I think, as you rightly said, the gospel is somewhat weakened by the lack there. In the first case, that friendliness aspect, the lack of that friendliness makes the church less attractive than its truth and its worship would really suggest it should be. In the second church, perhaps the cloudy thinking means that ultimately the code might get a bit mixed up and confused because the questions that arise about how Christians should behave ultimately track back to how we understand human beings made in the image of God. So there's a weakness there. And one of the things I would suggest to listeners or to readers of the book is, reflect on your own church and think about where the strengths and where the weaknesses are and see what one can do to compensate them. Because code without creed becomes mere outward performance or mere legalism. Creed without code becomes a dead orthodoxy, and neither of them are attractive, compelling manifestations of the gospel.
Carl, in writing this book, how have you been changed?
Well, what you read, Todd, was actually the fifth draft.
So you become more patient.
My editor, Bria Sanford at Penguin Random House, she's a great editor. I've never been edited without improvement. I have to say, when she asked for the 5th draft, I waited 24 hours before I dropped her a note because I didn't want to say something I'd regret. She was absolutely right. But what she wanted from me was more of that hope.
Yeah.
That she wanted. Yes, it's easy to engage in the everything's going to the dogs and we've just got to sit and twiddle our thumbs until everything gets destroyed at the end of time. What she really wanted me to do was to produce a book that Christians and non-Christians could both read and have a positive vision of what Christianity would set forth for society. So I would say what it's done is it's intensified my commitment to trying to be hopeful, to taking my personal Christian hope and making that a component part of my cultural analysis or cultural criticism. And thanks very much to Bria at Penguin for pushing me hard on that point.
Carl Trueman, Christian, professor, and author of The Desecration of Man. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Always a pleasure to chat to you, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
So I've been thinking. In her book, A Historian and His World, A Life of Christopher Dawson, Christina Scott asserted that renowned Catholic historian Christopher Dawson, quote, viewed the disintegration of the Western culture as a far worse disaster than that of the fall of Rome. For the one was material, the other would be a spiritual disaster, which would strike directly at the moral foundations of our society and destroy not the outward form of civilization, but the soul of man, which is the beginning and the end of all human culture, close quote. This is also the premise of Carl Trueman's gripping book, The Desecration of Man. If politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion, what becomes of our politics and culture when the well springs of religion run dry? What becomes of our sense of self in a world where God is declared dead? What is lost in this dark turn of events? Well, just look around and you will see. What is lost is the notion of human dignity, rooted in being a child of God. What is lost is the sense of the sacred in sacramental marriage, fertility, and fecundity. What is lost is the acknowledgement of a Christian anthropology brilliantly alive in virtue and sensibly restrained from vice. All of this is jettisoned for a deformed anthropology that defines itself exclusively in that which gives pleasure and that which seizes power. It is this warped anthropology which ruins not only lives but societies. Is it any wonder that Nietzsche's madman chaotically burst into the marketplace, frantically searching and sounding alarm? What are we doing, the madman cried, when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? This is what happens when we live as if God is dead. Darkness consumes like the eclipse upon Christ's passing. No truths remain. All is permitted. Power reigns supreme, and the devil has his day. But Nietzsche is wrong, and God is not dead. And so we are all called to pray and partake in the sacraments, engage in the spiritual and corporal works of mercy, and as articulated in Psalm 104, ask the Lord to send forth your Spirit and renew the face of the earth. Desecration is the work of the devil, the scatterer, but reconsecration is the work of the all-power, ever-living God. Today, let's do our part to revive the sense of the sacred and renew the stature of man. And one last thing, read Carl Trueman's The Desecration of Man, but also take a look at Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science, from where the allegory of the madman originates. Wrestle with both the wisdom and madness of Nietzsche, and take seriously the consequences of a culture that lives as if God is dead. Let us be the salt and light who, with God, reconsecrates man, woman, and the culture in which we live. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Tod Worner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.